Welcome back to today's video. This is our second video in our Medicine Through Time series. Today's video will be covering rational explanations for the cause of disease in the medieval period, most notably the theory of the four humours. This was a theory coined by Hippocrates, an ancient Greek physician, and the theory stated that all humans were made up of four liquids. These liquids were referred to as humours, and they are black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. Hippocrates taught that for a person to remain well, they had to ensure that all their humours were balanced. If a humour was found to be in excess, so that means if there was too much of one humour, then a person would then fall ill. These humours were then linked to a person's symptoms, and a physician would detect which humour a person had in excess by examining their symptoms. So for example, if their symptoms were cold and wet, it was thought that they had too much phlegm. As you can see from the chart on the screen, the humours were often linked to seasons, and often a different season would correspond to the humour that was in excess. So for example, in winter, most physicians would be expecting that people's phlegm was in surplus or in excess. Physicians would also use what are called urine charts, or as they called it, uroscopy wheels. These wheels essentially required a patient's urine to be examined. So a patient would be asked to wee into a cup, and the colour of that urine would then be examined. The colour would indicate which humour they had in excess. So for example, if the urine was a dark brown colour, then it was thought that they had black bile in excess. Now, these urine charts were used to diagnose a patient's humour that they had in excess, and then could be then linked to treatment. And yes, it is true, in many cases, the physicians would also taste the urine as well to try and kind of work out which urine was, which humour was in excess. Now, in addition to Hippocrates' theory, we have another man called Galen, and you can see him on the screen right now. Now, Galen was based in ancient Rome, and he adds to the theory of the four humours, he had something called the theory of opposites. A lot of students will say that Galen came up with the theory of the four humours. This is simply not correct. He develops the theory by introducing the theory of opposites. Now, crucially, the theory of opposites is a significant development because it is a key treatment that could be used universally. The theory of opposites states that a patient should consume the opposite of his or her symptoms. So if your symptoms were wet, cold and wet, then you would have a phlegm in excess, and Galen would argue that you should be eating something which is hot and dry. For example, a chili pepper might be perfect. So when explaining the significance of Galen, we should be saying in the exam that it is a treatment that he adds which develops the theory of the four humours. Now, in terms of why the theory of the four humours remains such an important theory, there are several different reasons. Firstly, as we saw in the last video, dissection was banned, which meant that discoveries of the anatomy and the human body, there was little progress made in those areas. Secondly, people's attitudes at the time were anti-scientific. As we saw in the last video, the majority of people were working in fields. They were not open to new ideas. And the most important thing that you need to know for the exam is the power of the church. So the church taught Galen and Hippocrates' ideas, and the reason why they taught that is because those theories align very closely with church beliefs. The Bible teaches that all humans are made perfectly in God's image, and the theory of the four humours lines up very nicely with that teaching, because Hippocrates' theory could easily be manipulated given that it starts with the premise that all humans have four liquids in balance. According to the theory of the four humours, a patient's illness is therefore the patient's fault. So we all start with our four humours in balance, but if a patient chooses to live a certain lifestyle, they might have a humour in excess. Therefore, the fault of illness is not God, but rather it is the patient who has made poor decisions. So therefore, it aligned very closely with what the church was teaching, and that is why, as a theory, it persisted. Lastly, the theory of the four humours was what we would call a rational explanation, and that means it pretends to be scientific. Given that it sounds plausible, And given that people at the time had limited scientific understanding, this serves to explain why it remains such a powerful theory. And in fact, it won't be until the next video that we see people actually trying to challenge the theory of the four humours. The only other rational explanation you need to know for the exam is miasma. Now, miasma is the theory that bad smells are linked to disease and to the origins of disease. And this theory makes sense. At the time, people were surrounded by swamps. There were often dead carcasses of animals lying in the road, sometimes even human bodies as well. The smell of cities, with the fact that there were no sewers, would mean that the stench was unbearable. And people at the time actually associated bad pungent smells with illness. In fact, churches at the time used to burn incense on a daily basis because they thought that it would ward away against these foul miasmas. People at the time as well put pressure on keeping their homes clean and devoid of terrible smells. And in fact, a person's house and the smell of their home was actually linked to how clean and how illness-free a person was. In fact, it was said by King Edward III that the Black Death was, and I quote, result of the filth within people's homes. So clearly then, in the medieval period, illness is attributed to a person's poor decisions. So if you're found to have a humour in excess, that means that your lifestyle is not perfect, and as a result, your humours are not balanced. Similarly, if your home is foul smelling, then that means you're more likely to contract a disease. And as such, illness was the fault of the person themselves. This is crucial because in modern understandings of illness, we now see illness as something external to us as humans. So if I fall sick now, it's because a virus or a bacteria has entered my system. Whereas back in the medieval period, illness, or the feeling of being unwell, was actually the result of a person's own decisions in life. Right, we'll leave it there, and I'll see you all in the next video where we'll be looking at some of the medieval preventions and treatments that were introduced.